Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having me, and you could even treat me poorly, and I will probably come back. I'm really pleased to be here and speak with you. You're people who care about Paul, and people who care about Paul's voice are the primary audience I think about all the time, because I think about his voice all the time, and when I read others who've thought about his voice, it's a different voice than I usually see when I read his letters. And what I'm seeking to do is to inform you about the way that I've read his voice in conversation with other voices that read him in the contemporary scene. So I want to do a little bit, in this particular lecture, I want to do a little bit with history. How am I doing? Can you hear me all the way? All right?
Can I just interrupt?
Yeah.
So there's seats up in the corner you're welcome to, those of you on the floor, or you can sit in the center aisle, and there are handouts at each table. So when Mark refers to the handout, pass those around.
Yep.
I have a few extras up here, so come on up.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, you need one of those, or to be looking on with someone else. About 50 years ago, next year in fact will be the celebration of 50 years ago, there was a momentous change in Christian discourses about Jews and Judaism. It came out of Vatican II, the Catholic meeting, and particularly the part of that called Nostra Aetate number 4, which was Christian views of other religions. In the early 60s, this was a profound change. Almost nowhere in Christianity before this was there a discourse about Jews and about Judaism that had the kind of positive view that the Catholic Church announced at that time. Why it happened at that time and why it happened with Catholics first is a large story, one we won't be discussing. But obviously one of the elements with that was the recognition after World War II of the implications of the reading of the New Testament and Christian theology in the way that they had been, where the stereotyping and negative ways of Jews and Judaism had become so common, and they shaped Western culture in such a way that these evil people could do what they did. Now, if you've studied the medieval period, you know how this rhetoric, how strong this rhetoric can be. Vatican II, and I'm going to show you a few statements. Vatican II is where I'll start talking about it. But what I want to show you today is that in spite of this profound change, one of the realities about all discourses is it's very hard for them to change at the deep level. Feminists have been making tremendous efforts with us men for a number of years to understand what it means to say you're equal. And part of the problem is that well-meaning men still have a discourse. And it takes a woman's ear sometimes to say, is that really what you meant to say? Do you not hear it? And no, maybe we didn't. But men of goodwill who really want to change, they need that provocation to recognize, oh, I shouldn't say that anymore. I should think about it differently. So even when you start to try to think differently, it's not easy because of the ways in which we thought and we speak. I consider myself a Christian-Jewish or Jewish-Christian relations critic in the same way as a feminist critic would be. A Jewish person who reads Christian discourses about Jews and Judaism and hears things that well-meaning Christian theologians don't seem to hear. And so part of my task, I say this partly because I don't want to offend anyone. I come from outside. I'm not trying to throw stones. But I am trying to awaken awareness, and it takes a critical look at things and sometimes putting them in a critical light. Can you imagine how this sounds to me? And perhaps you never thought about it that way. Whether that means that it's a correct way to read Paul's voice is one thing. But thinking about what it is and maybe having some cross-cultural distance from it before you embrace it and repeat it is something that you want to think about. So what I'm going to do is talk about Romans chapter 11 because At Nostra Aetate of Vatican II, Romans 11 was a foundational text to which they appealed. And what I want to show you is that the translations now, 49 years later, have not caught up one bit with the new sentiments they expressed, and in some cases, they're worse. So that the discourse itself about this topic is not helping well-meaning people get to where they could go, not just because they mean well, but because, as I'll show you, there are alternative historical ways to read Paul that actually go where Vatican II pointed, more profoundly than they've gone. And I'm finishing right now with a Catholic theologian an article so we can publish it for the 50th anniversary in order to point in this way and continue to challenge, because within the Catholic Church there are those that actually want to pull back from the sentiments of Vatican II. Likewise, I'm sure this is the same in many Protestant organizations. So the first thing to show you is how they made this statement. The Jews remain very dear to God for the sake of the patriarchs, since God does not take back the gifts he bestowed or the choice he made. This is almost a literal citation of Romans 11, verse 28. You have this on your handouts, 28 and 29. Pope John Paul II furthered this later in the 90s and 2000s with statements like this: they are our dearly beloved brothers, our elder brothers. Their covenant's based on a living heritage. You never heard this before. The people of God of the Old Covenant, never revoked by God. In other words, the Jews are still in a living covenant with God. Not that the covenant's over and there's only a new Christian covenant. This is coming from the Catholic Church. The present-day people of the covenant concluded with Moses. Present-day people of the covenant. Partners in a covenant of eternal love which was never revoked. All of this language is right there out of 11, 28 to 29, with a few other scattering places in Romans, chapter 9 and chapter 11. Cardinal Walter Casper furthered this in a very specific citation. As Christians, we know that God's covenant with Israel by God's faithfulness is not broken. Romans 11, 29, 3, 4, and others. The United Church of Christ and many other Protestant organizations have made similar statements in the years since the mid-60s. This one is, God's covenant with the Jewish people has not been rescinded or abrogated by God, but remains in full force inasmuch as the gifts and the promise of God are irrevocable. Romans 11, 29. The United Methodist Church. We believe that just as God is steadfastly faithful to the biblical covenant in Jesus Christ, likewise, this is interesting, yeah? Likewise, God is steadfastly faithful to the biblical covenant with the Jewish people. Both Jews and Christians are bound to God in a covenant with no covenantal relationship invalidated by any other covenant. So you see where we have the sentiment that's being expressed. Now I want to go back 500 years or so for a moment to Calvin's commentaries. Calvin had a front plate in all of his commentaries based on Romans 11. This is the one from Genesis, but it's the same. You could find it in all of his commentaries if you could get those kinds of editions. In Latin, translation is something like, I shall be inserted as a branch, they are broken off. And if you look at this image, can all of you see this image? Is it all right there? If you look at this image from the top down, you see the cloud with two hands, one holding a sickle and one holding a branch. That would be God. And if you look a little further down, you'll see there are these balls on all of the branches here. And these are places where a graft is being illustrated. And if you look closely, you'll see that all of the major branches have one of these. Then you'll see that there are branches in the process of falling to the ground that God has cut off, and there are others gathering on the ground. Not actually quite enough of them to make sense of the amount that had to be cut off. But anyway, when Calvin appeals to this, you put on your Christian-Jewish relations feminist criticism ears now with me. When Calvin sees himself kneeling and thanking God for the mercy he's shown to him, it's based on a replacement theology. It's based on a zero-sum kind of thinking. Because they're out, I'm in. Not only that, but it's based on the idea that every one of them is out. And every one of them needs to be grafted back in. Sound a bit like Christian theology that you're familiar with? Jews, the same as Gentiles, all need to be saved. This is all part of this thinking. And so what he meant in a very positive way carries with it a certain other sound, another voice. When a Jewish person sees this and says, wow, so you think that's mercy, so you think that's God's like, so you think he would do the same to you, and you would celebrate that? For the next guy to get in, you have to be out? You might see through that a little bit differently if you read it that way. This thinking is still in the way the text is translated, and in most of the commentaries that discuss that translation. So what I've got in your handout is a little bit more than what I'm going to have on the PowerPoint. What you have in your handout is on one side the New Revised Standard Version translation in English, and on the other side the Greek. And I have highlighted here, as I've done in your handout, certain words or phrases that I want to talk about. I could talk about more, but we have so much time and a certain kind of emphasis to make here. And then you'll see in brackets some places where I have offered a different translation, either an alternative or a more literal translation. And in some cases where I'm saying that word isn't even in the Greek manuscripts that they've added here, which in some case carries a lot of freight, a lot of theological freight. And I'm going to take you through this text kind of bouncing around a little bit. So it's a fabulous text to talk about in many ways. Not only because of the importance that I've just showed you, but because it's graphic, and that makes it nice to talk about. It's not as boring as some things could be. It also, if you're a literary major, or if you've studied literary theory or other kinds of theories related to that, you'll appreciate the literary qualities that are here. And one of the things that I've tried to do in that translation, which I brought a book just to show you, it's called the Jewish Annotated New Testament, for which I did Romans with the annotations, which got me started a few years ago on a commentary I'm completing for Erdman's, in which I try to show you a whole new translation and reading of this as a Jewish text read within synagogue communities, subgroups of Christ believers within synagogue communities, which is what I propose. So I'll take you through some of what happens. Now I'm picking up in the middle of an argument, but a transitional one at verse 11. So I ask, have they stumbled? And Paul is using kind of a diatribe voice, a fictive character. He's going to create other characters to talk to. This one asks the question, have they stumbled so as to fall? The they there is Israelites. Not all Israelites, because Paul has just finished saying, hey, I'm an Israelite. So it's not Israel. Well, it's only Israel in the sense that some of Israel. And as you would look at it, and I would look at it later, we could say almost all Jews, almost all Israelites. But at Paul's time, the jury was still out. Have they stumbled so as to fall? And the answer of Christian theology would be yes. Paul's answer is no way. It's a strong Greek phrase. Meganita, no way. But through their stumbling, salvation has come to the Gentiles so as to make Israel jealous. So he begins an argument. And I'm going to read just a little bit more before I come back and try to reframe it. Now, if their stumbling means riches for the world And if there, and I have highlighted defeat, because the Greek word here, obviously you could translate it defeat. There it is. But I'll show you that's probably not the best choice, given the metaphor he's working with and the argument he's making. If there, defeat means riches for the nations, for the ethne, the Gentiles, how much more will the full inclusion mean? Now, I'm speaking to you Gentiles, which is ethne, so I would prefer to use nations, and you'll hear me use this. Members from the nations other than Israel. Israel's also an ethnos, a nation, but usually it's being used in contrast to Israel, so it's all the rest. Inasmuch as I'm the apostle to the nations, I glorify my ministry to the nations in order to make my own people jealous and thus rescue, save some of them. For if there, and here we have one I didn't accent, but rejection, you'll see in your handout, I challenge this, is the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? What's life from the dead? An image. Resurrection, yeah? And then we'll stop there for a moment. Let me talk to you about this first metaphor. What Paul is proposing here, and in his metaphor, trying to sort of unpack and actually work, well, he both supports it in a sense, but then he sees the problem and tries to get out of it, is a zero-sum kind of thinking. Think about this image here. It basically is the idea, listen, Israel is supposed to be the messenger to the nations with God's news. That's Isaiah. And Paul quoted that in Romans 3:2 as his answer. Is there any advantage to Jews and circumcision? And the answer, Christian theology, would be no. But Paul didn't say that. He said, yes. They're entrusted with the words of God. Oracles. And so the idea is, from Isaiah is basically the messengers are standing on the wall. And in antiquity, the good news or bad news comes from the next town. You don't have CNN. And you don't know if your boys lost the battle or won the battle. And you're waiting to find out if your women are going to be raped and pillaged and you need to get out of town. Or if you won and it's time to celebrate and some of your boys are coming home. And so they're waiting on the walls to get the news to go tell everybody else. And this is the image Paul's working with here. Some of them are walking along or running along with the news. And some trip. Do they trip so much that they hit the ground, that they fall? And the answer is no. It's a temporary loss of step. Now, if you think in race terms, and some of you are no doubt athletes here, when your competitors have something happen that gives them pause, guess what? Your chances of winning go up. All athletic events are zero-sum events. It's one winner. And it's kind of a good thing if you get an advantage, whether you celebrate it or not. And what he's trying to do is fight that zero-sum thinking here. You see it? If it's your advantage that they stumble, guess what? It's going to be even better when they gain their footing and they succeed. That goes against the grain. So he's trying to pull out something here that zero-sum thinking that he's already played to can't really get you to. I think of it come from Kansas City now. Wagon trains went through there coming out your way. Smart people were on those wagon trains. And some of them had to get fixed in Independence or Kansas City. Those wagon trains had wheels that needed to be realigned or replaced. And that made room in the wagon train for some new wagons to come in to the wagon train. In a zero-sum game, if there can only be 10 going across Kansas and Colorado, then you got in and others were out, and that's good. But he would be fighting that, saying, no, this wagon train won't successfully get to Oregon or California until all of the wagons who were left behind for a short time catch up. And we all make it. It's not a successful trip until then. So he's fighting this sort of zero-sum thinking. Now, when we start with this image, it's really important because the next image he's going to bring up, it's a metaphor that he actually makes into an allegory, a string, a more development, and it actually fights against what he's just said here. So in 16, I'll just read this and then we'll flip to the next. Well, let me just make sure. I think I might have 16 on. No, I don't. So on 16 he says, if part of the dough offered as first fruits is holy, holy means, anybody? What's our, holy means set apart, perfect, well taught, well learned. Set apart to God. If the first part's been set apart to God, then the whole thing has been set apart to God. It's been made set apart. It's different than others. And if the root is set apart to God, then so too are the branches from that root. It's not like other vines, in this case probably he's imagining, or a tree is what he's going to go to, an olive tree. And so at 11:17 he says, now if some of the branches were, and this word here in Greek, for those of you who don't know it, just the basic simple part that this verb is based around is ekklao, E-K-K-L-A-O, if you're trying to write it down in English. If some of the branches were ekklaoed, if you will, and you, a wild shoot, were grafted in their place, does that sound like replacement theology, literally? But to share the rich root of the olive tree, do not boast over the branches. And this word boast over is kind of a graphic word. If you were a branch, put in higher, don't look down on these other, sort of Calvin's image would be that they're out of the tree, but this image seems to be that they're in the tree and you would look down on them. And I'm going to show you why I think that's probably better, and then I'll come back and read on through this. So let me make a few points right here. Do you see the first problem we have at 11:17 with the metaphor we just finished of temporary stumbling but have not fallen and broken off? Problem? Dissonance? Yeah? So the first thing I did was, which I did not do when I wrote my first book on Romans, I did this in 2007 or 8 when I was working on a paper for a conference, and I went back and I finally looked at the lexicons and said, because I had been reading papers and stuff and even repeated this many times and thought, gosh, it just grates. It's just guess what? Ekklao doesn't have to be broken off. Wycliffe's translation from the Latin actually had just broken, which was picked up in the later Catholic version. If you've ever seen those big white ones that were from the 20th century, that translation also just had broken. But all the others, in almost all the other languages of which I've consulted people when I've talked about this or could ask them, say broken off or cut off. But ekklao is used in the lexicon also for a situation, for example, where two guys are wrestling and one of them reaches down and ekklaos the other guy's toe. You suppose he tore it off his foot? Highly unlikely. In wrestling, he dislocated it. He pulled it out of the joint. Yeah? He bent it. What would happen if we read this bent? If some of the branches were bent, dislocated, disjointed. Well, we're talking about olive trees. How do you gather olives? What's the name of the road coming right up here? How do we gather olives? Grab them, get some sticks and beat them up high. I'm sure they do some higher tech stuff like that, but in Paul's day, you get some collateral damage. And no doubt you break some, but you bend some, you harm some. It's part of the process of gathering the fruit. Then it says, you, a wild olive shoot, guess what? It's singular. Can you imagine Calvin's picture? Remember that? There's only one wild shoot in a tree full of natural branches. In Paul's image, literally, one that he talks to, that he singles out for a conversation here. And it's a scolding. You, a wild shoot, were grafted, and then the Greek is en altis. Anybody from Greek here? What does that mean? Among them, or in them, among them. Oh, guess what? Calvin's image, if the new branch was grafted among them, where would that be? Somewhere in the air or somewhere on the ground? Because that's where they are. They have to still be in the tree to be grafted among them. Bent works pretty well for that. You with me? Because he says to share in the rich root of the olive tree. Most other translations besides the New Revised Standard Version, supposedly celebrated as the most neutral, actually don't have in their place. That's an innovation. And it's not appropriate. But it tells you something about the theologians who were working on this translation. Because where he's driving this is, hey, you sharing from the same root as those other branches. Well, they're not sharing from it if they've been cut off. Do not boast over them now makes sense. Oh, you've been placed in kind of high, apparently. It's the image. If you do boast, if you would boast, remember this. It's not you who supports the root, but the root supports you. So this is about the precarious place of that one branch and the temptation to arrogance. You can see why I worry a little about being offensive, but hey, this is Paul's language. You will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. Now he puts words in their mouth to put them in this negative light. This word is again eklao, so they're actually just saying branches were broken or bent. By the way, ancient grafting wasn't by cutting off a branch and putting a branch to it. It was by making a slit in the larger branch that you stuck it into. So there's no need to even think about it the way that you might think about it. Not the grafting of olive trees, which is still true today. My understanding from a specialist on olive trees, not from my own experience. Then this next word is translated, that is true, and it's basically something like, you would say rhetorically to somebody, okay, well, it's not really that is true, but they were eklao, broken, bent, because of their apistia, which we would, it's translated unbelief, but I would recommend unfaithfulness. Because our image here is that whether they're announcing the news to the nations alongside Paul or not, they've stumbled in a metaphor or they've been bent, they're impaired in doing their job. Seems to be what the issue is. Have they been unfaithful? But you stand only through your faithfulness. So do not become arrogant, proud, looking from above. And then it translates it, stand in awe. This is one of those equivocations, if I can put it nicely. What it says is, but be afraid. Be scared. You are precariously placed here, and arrogance will not be rewarded. Faithfulness will be. Now I wanted to keep the first part, so we're picking back up where I've left off at 21. If God didn't spare the natural branches, and then we have perhaps inserted here, but there's no perhaps, or it's unlikely. Some later manuscripts seem to have it, but we can understand how it might creep in. He will not spare you. Pretty nasty, pretty tough. He's got some teenagers on his hands here, and he's reading them the riot act. I sent you to school, and you could at least make a phone call to mom on Sunday. Note then the kindness and severity of God. Severity towards you those who have fallen. How did that get in there? What did he just say? Have they fallen? No. And if he's using bent as I propose, where did this come from? Mixed metaphor? Literary studies? You know about those? We all do. I think that we get one here. But God's kindness towards you, provided you continue in his kindness. You see again. What is he trying to get across? You better worry about being faithful to what you've been given, not judging somebody else. Otherwise, you also will be cut off. Now here's where the problem comes in. This Greek word is not the same one as this one that we had up here as bent. This is a root ekopto, not eklao, but ekopto. E-K-K-T-O-P-O. That means cut off. it means you top a tree or something like that. Pruning. It's an appropriate word. But who's he talking about? And who's he talking to when he's moved here to this diatribe with this wild branch? Is he talking about Israel anymore over there, those other branches? No, he's talking to you. But he gets himself into trouble, doesn't he? And he's trying to work it out. He changes the verb to cut off, but wait a minute. He uses also. Why didn't he use the same verb? Why did it come to that? Because what was the wild branch from? A different tree. And how did it get there? It got a koptod. That makes sense kind of how he got there, but you see he has a bit of a problem. And he's starting to figure out, because he wants to do what we call an a fortiori, right? And all the more. If he would do it to natural branches, what do you think he's going to do to this precariously placed single branch? You better not be arrogant. You better be all the more concerned, because they're natural, you're not. Those of you who know horticulture, you know that you pray for that graft to take more than you do for the natural branch which you expect to grow. And even those of Israel, if they do not persist in their, again this word unfaithfulness I would recommend, will be, but unbelief can be fine, but I think it's unfaithfulness to the task, will be grafted in, for God has the power to graft them in again. Oh, so now we're going to reach out to God's miraculous power. Because no farmer, no horticulturist goes in and cuts off branches in order to regraft them into the tree. That's never the intention. And if it waits very long, it's highly unlikely. But God could do it. He could make dead branches into live ones. We hear echoes of Ezekiel, those of you who know this kind of language. God can do anything. If you have been cut from what is by nature a wild tree and grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated tree, how much more, a fortiori, will these natural branches be grafted back into their own olive tree? Now that, if you take that last part and you backfill it, you see how we get cut off all the way through. And I don't deny that you can make this case. It's been made. It's the only thing you'll mainly see. It's one I worked on this 20-some years ago and still worked with. But I challenge it. I don't think that Paul means that. I think that Paul is trying to save, if you will, the allegory and make it line up with the earlier fight against the zero-sum game all the more in order to get the wild shoot really to ridicule it. He realizes some implications there, some problems that arise for the implications for Israel. And he tries to bail it out. The bottom line here is it's really not trying to be a picture of Israel. And people will bring up or want to talk about or argue that Israel, you know, the tree is Israel and blah, blah, blah. He doesn't tell us what it is, but I would suggest the tree is the people of God. And the branches of Israel are the natural, the historical people of God. And another person representing the rest of the nations has been added to that. They're the people of God. And it's based on the people who've been faithful, Abrahamic faith, if you will, or something like this, that we all participate in. You're not grafted into Israel, but you're grafted among the Israelites into the people of God. I would say that's what his basic image is. But pushing metaphors around or allegories can get problematic. Now he makes a transition here at 11:25. He's done with the allegory proper, but I think he still refers metaphorically to it as he makes his future statements. So that you may not claim you're wiser than you are, brothers and sisters, I want you to understand this mystery. And then it says, a hardening has come upon part of Israel until the full number of the Gentiles has come in, and so all Israel will be saved or rescued. As it is written, and then he gives you passages that he's spliced together from a couple of places in Isaiah that basically say, hey, I got a covenant with them. So this covenant language, whenever you hear covenant language, what do you think of? Formal partnership, like a marriage, like a family. When you misbehave, whether it's a spouse or the children, you have, well, with the spouse, allow me this for a moment. Let's say children. You have disciplinary action. You have time out, maybe. You have no TV, no cell phone, whatever it might be. But the object of that is to restore the relationship, correct? And very unlikely that you throw them out of the house, to stay metaphorically here, cut them off. And this language of covenant that he uses to prove his argument is that, of course, maybe some Israelites are being unfaithful, but God will not be unfaithful to them. This is part of the disciplinary process. They're misbehaving, but it will be repaired. God's punishing them. How does he punish them? Well, one of the strange ways is he's bringing you in, which I'm using as a strategy to make them jealous of you. Sounds like adoption of a child into a family, kind of straighten up the rest of the ones who felt entitled and privileged. And he actually says jealous of his ministry, and here's my claim, and those of you in the apocalyptic class, listen carefully. Here's my claim. What he's saying is, what he's doing, this whole strategy is to say to his fellow Jews, empirically it might not look like what I'm saying is true. I can't prove Jesus is resurrected. I can't prove the end of the ages has happened. But I got something empirical to show you here. I got these little Gentiles who are coming in amongst us, worshiping our God, who are leaving their gods, their family cult, their civic cult at great cost to themselves. Learning righteousness, Romans 6, no longer slaves of sin, but slaves of righteousness, acting just like we're waiting for the end of the ages for the rest of the nations to worship our God. Well, what do you think, my fellow Jews? Maybe something's happened here. Aren't we all supposed to announce this news to the nations? And so then they will say, yeah, why are we missing out on this? They'll be jealous. Because jealous is a positive term usually in the Bible. It means to want it. To, what's the word I want? To emulation. Emulation would be a better gloss sometimes. The negative word that we use them interchangeably is envy, phonos in the Greek, which is to begrudge. He's not saying begrudge here. He's saying to want what Paul has. The Gentiles are turning to their God, and they're missing out. They're the fellow heralds. They're the ones stumbling. They're the ones bent. They're the ones falling behind. Now they'll be... So that's an eschatological, a realized eschatology. I call it chronometrical. Chronometrical, time-oriented claim. Because other Jews would agree, yeah, that's fine, that's appropriate when that time comes. The question is, has that time arrived? Paul says yes. How's he going to prove it? This is the way. So, what I think he's explaining here, and I'm running out of time, so I just want to quickly tell you a couple more issues that arise in this translation that could be so much better, so much more in keeping with the sentiments that Vatican II articulated and others have since. And many people of goodwill would want to go there, but they don't think the text allows them to go there. This word hardening has come part of Israel. How nice does that sound? When my students write papers on this, and they're all about how Paul is being ecumenical and nice about his fellow Jews, but they're hardened. That doesn't sound nicey nice, because what do you think of? Who's hardened in the Bible? Pharaoh's heart is hardened. But when Pharaoh's heart is hardened, the Greek word is skleros. Here the Greek word is porosis. Porosis is only used in ancient medical textbooks. And it's used for a callus that forms to protect a broken limb so that life can be conducted until it gets healed. So that the whole body keeps functioning. It's a positive term. Could you translate it hardening as a callus get hard? Well, yeah. But not in the same way that's being used for Pharaoh's heart and stubbornness. No, it's a positive thing. And the next phrase that's called part of Israel is actually an adverbial phrase, apomerus, which could be translated that way. But later in Romans, when Paul says he can't get there yet to Rome, but he says he's going to get there after a while, apomerus. It's a time element word. So a callus has formed to protect Israel for a while, until the fullness of the nations begins, which is a big topic we will go into. But the point he's driving at is so all Israel will be rescued. And we can hear all this language in the echo of the olive tree. You're rescuing a tree. It's got some branches that are damaged. Fullness of a tree could be the graft taking hold, could be the time of fruit. Callus is formed on the branches that have been harmed in order to keep bearing fruit and the tree to be a valuable tree and not get cut down. We have the quotation, and then we get to the phrases that the Vatican II quoted. Regarding the gospel, they are enemies, notice, of God in the pink here, for your sake. Of God is in no manuscript. No manuscript. And it's in almost no translations before the RSV and RSV. It's tragic. It's one of the most egregious things I've seen in my reading of the text. The word enemies can be read as a noun. However, the next phrase says, they're regarding election, they're beloved for the sake of the ancestors. This is the same form. Here it's beloved is what form of speech? Adjective, right? So then why is it enemies? Why isn't it alienated, estranged? Something like that has to do with stumbling, bent, hurt. They're being hurt for your sake, but they're beloved for the sake of the fathers. The promises have been made. Why? And then we get our famous phrase. Because the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. God basically literally means God can't repent of them. He can't turn back. So here's where we get our phrase. But how could somebody, and by the way, this next part, just quickly, I've highlighted disobedient because in every place that disobedience is, it's possible to read it that way. Obviously, it's there. But it can all be read as something more like unconvinced, unpersuaded. I mean, that's the point. His fellow Jews are not yet persuaded of this. He thinks they will be. For him, it's a not yet. But this word isn't the word you normally would translate obey and disobey with. It's a word that normally would be translated something to do with persuasion. But just to finish with this point that I hopefully have set up for you, and by the way, I have a pretty picture to show you at the end here of olive trees from Van Gogh. The point I hope that I can make for you is if someone left a Catholic sermon today or a Protestant sermon today and it said, you know, your views of Jews and Judaism should be a lot nicer than they used to be. They're our fellow brothers in a covenant that's never been revoked. And you went home to tell your family members or friends about this and you opened up Romans 11 to help you get there. It wouldn't help you very well, but it could. And it would be consistent with an alternative, many alternative translation choices in the historical Paul's voice. It's not just me, a multicultural, postmodern Jewish guy who wants you to make nice, which I'm all of those things. But it's consistent with a way to read Paul's historical voice that's actually much more respectful, much more benign than the history of church discourse might lead you to believe was possible. In ending, I'll just say this. My mom had little interest in reading my books. But she got very sick after Mystery of Romans came out, and she was stuck in a bed for a long enough time that she read maybe a few pages. I don't know. She said the book. So far, I've witnessed very little of that. I usually see the marker within the page or two or three of the reading beginning. But she did say this, to brag on my mom. She said this, I get what you're saying, son. If you've received a gift, you shouldn't be judgmental. You should be gracious. And so why did I write a whole big book? You know? But I think that's what Paul's trying to say here, don't you? So we can argue and quibble about this or that, which we should, but let's not miss the bottom line point. So I thank you.